The cost of silence. It began with a spreadsheet. Not a fight, not a secret lover, not even a late-night phone call that should have gone unanswered. No, it was a spreadsheet, its columns wide and clean, its rows lined like soldiers, and its formulas as cold as frostbite. And in the margins of that neat little file, where numbers whispered truths no one wanted to hear, a life began to unravel on the surface. The Stone family had everything that glossy magazines praised and envy devoured. A house with glass walls, perched on a hillside, where sunrises stretched across polished floors and dinners were taken under sculpted lighting. Max Stone, the patriarch, carried a calm authority that people trusted instinctively. He was one of those men who seemed born in a Navy suit, with a voice that could negotiate silence out of thunder. His wife, Elise, wore elegance like a second skin. She never rushed, never raised her tone, and her beauty had the sort of precision usually found only in architecture. Their lifestyle was curated. Every painting on the wall, every wine in the cellar, every weekend retreat. To neighbors and friends, they weren't just wealthy, they were tasteful, measured, stable, but no one saw the spreadsheet. It sat, hidden but not encrypted, on Max's personal drive. A file named review_Q3_2024 because blandness makes the perfect disguise. And it were numbers not meant for Elise's eyes, at least not in the order they appeared. There, in black and red, were the sum totals of too many risks taken, too many assumptions made, and too much pride wagered on the illusion of control. The empire they had built was eroding beneath them, line by line. What made it worse was how long Max had known, and what he had done to keep the silence alive. In truth, the story had started much earlier. This spreadsheet was not the beginning but a mirror, finally tilted just right to reflect a truth that had grown too large to contain. For years, Max had been rearranging the furniture of their finances, hiding cracks beneath rugs of temporary liquidity and fresh investments. The margins of their reality had always been carefully edited. He was, after all, a financial architect. His job had always been to make the unsustainable look seamless. But numbers are not opinions. They do not flatter, and they do not forget. And now they were spelling out something unavoidable: collapse. Yet, it wasn't the collapse itself that would shatter everything. It was the way he chose to handle it. Or perhaps, the way he chose not to. Because Max wasn't the kind of man who asked for help. Not even from Elise. Especially not from Elise. The truth, when it finally slipped into the light, didn't shout. It didn't arrive with drama or spectacle. It came gently, like a needle in silk. But once it pierced the surface, it unraveled. Everything with quiet cruelty. This is a story about wealth, but not the kind that headlines flaunt. It's about the intimacy of money, the way it binds and blinds, the way it turns secrets into survival and marriages into negotiations. It's about Elise and Max, two people who once vowed forever, only to find that nothing corrodes trust quite like money, especially when it's running out. And it's about a choice, an unthinkable, silent, desperate choice that would change both of them forever, because some debts are financial, others are emotional, and the hardest ones to repay are the ones we never admitted we owed. Before the numbers bled red, before the margins whispered collapse, Max Stone had been the man people called when everything was on fire. For over 2 decades, he had navigated crises for other people, CEOs on the brink of bankruptcy, families fighting over trusts, couples who used spreadsheets to do what their words couldn't. He had made a career out of controlling chaos, or at least presenting a version of it that looked manageable. He wasn't a hedge fund mogul or a startup prodigy. Max operated in the elegant shadows of wealth management, where the truly rich whispered names of advisors like secrets. He curated financial legacies, shielding his clients from the brute unpredictability of the world. And for a long time, he believed he could do the same for himself, Elise, on the other hand, had never pretended to be in control of numbers. Her world was textures, hues, and intangible moods. She had once been a textile designer, back when inspiration meant long mornings in quiet studios and evenings with dusty sketches in her lap. But that had faded. Slowly, after their second miscarriage, after they moved to the hills, after Max suggested that maybe the stress of deadlines wasn't worth it anymore. At first, she agreed. There was a relief in letting go, in not chasing the next collection or fighting for shelf space in design galleries. But time became airless. Their days filled with social obligations disguised as leisure, charity luncheons, gallery openings, vineyard tastings. The edges of Elise's identity softened until they dissolved. Her creativity, once a current that surged without warning, was now a trickle she tried to coax with yoga, clean eating, and overpriced silence retreats. They had been married 15 years, together for 19. The kind of couple who knew what the other liked in their salad without asking, but could no longer remember the last time they had laughed at the same thing. Their arguments had calcified into patterns. They didn't yell, they withheld. When Elise felt unacknowledged, she retreated into curated detachment. When Max felt cornered, he turned to work, convinced he could solve their distance the same way he solved portfolios, with quiet, methodical precision. What they never talked about was the slow decay beneath their lives, the fertility treatments that had drained them emotionally and financially, the resentment Elise had buried when they downsized her studio to make space for Max's home office, the bruises no one could see, not on skin, but in the spaces where intimacy had once lived. Their son, Owen, was 10, a quiet child with a brain, built for structure, just like his father. He was the kind of boy who lined up his toy cars by color and always finished his homework before dinner. Max saw in him a kind of hopeful continuity, a future untainted by failure. Elise, though, often looked at Owen with a bittersweet ache. She loved him with a fierceness that frightened her sometimes. But part of her feared that their dysfunction was already imprinting on him in ways they couldn't yet measure. The house was paid off, or so Elise believed. Max had refinanced it twice in the last 5 years, once to cover an investment shortfall and again to float a client's delayed payout that never materialized. Each time, he told himself it was temporary, that he would fix it before she noticed, that this was what men like him did. Protect their families from truths that couldn't be undone, that he kept the new mortgage documents in a locked drawer, under old tax returns and forgotten warranties. The drawer key was always with him, tucked in a false compartment of his briefcase. No one asked questions because nothing in their lives suggested questions needed asking. Their friends were couples just like them, well-dressed, well-traveled, deeply rehearsed in the theater of affluence. Dinners were filled with mild complaints about renovations and private school politics. No one ever talked about money directly, not the way it really existed, not the late nights staring at balance sheets or the sinking guilt of paying for a lifestyle you no longer believed in. Max's firm, Halbert Financial, had been stable for years, but stable does not mean bulletproof. The digital economy was volatile. Clients were pulling back. Returns were under scrutiny, and Max had made a few bets, aggressive ones, that hadn't panned out. He had kept this from Elise not because he didn't trust her, but because he needed her to believe in him, in their life, in the version of their marriage that still looked whole. What he didn't realize, what he could never admit, was that Elise had long sensed something was wrong. Not in numbers, but in rhythm, in how often he checked his phone, in the way his eyes stayed open too long at night, blinking against truths he couldn't confess, in the fact that he hadn't taken her hand in weeks, though they slept in the same bed every night. She hadn't said anything, not yet, but she was beginning to look through him instead of at him, and beneath their glass-walled life, a quiet fault line had begun to stretch. It began with a letter from the bank, thin, crisp, and utterly forgettable in appearance. Elise found it on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a catalog and an invitation to a gallery showing she had no interest in attending. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She had simply been clearing the mail tray out of habit. The envelope was addressed to Max, but unlike the usual private banking correspondences with embossed logos and heavy paper stock, this one was plain, institutional, almost impersonal. She placed it on the kitchen counter, fully intending to leave it untouched. But as the minutes passed, her eyes kept returning to it. Something about the envelope, the paper's rigidity, the lack of any branding, it whispered unease. Finally, almost without deciding, she opened it. It wasn't a bill. Not directly. It was a notification of non-payment. A statement of intent from the mortgage lender to initiate a review of the home's refinancing status due to delinquency. On the last 3 payments. 3 payments. Her first instinct wasn't panic, it was disbelief. There had to be a mistake. The mortgage was paid off. Max had told her that years ago, when they celebrated paying down the final balance over champagne and takeout sushi on the deck. She remembered the moment with cinematic clarity. So either the bank was wrong or something else was. Elise folded the letter, tucked it into the back pocket of her notebook, and said nothing. Not yet. She didn't want to accuse Max, not without understanding the full picture. That evening, she watched him more closely. He was distracted, as usual, half listening to Owen talk about a class project while checking his phone with practice. Subtlety. His smile was there, but hollow, like a light bulb dimmed to the edge of visibility. The next day, she went to their filing cabinet. She had never gone through it before. Not really. Max handled all the paperwork. But now, searching through documents, insurance policies, old invoices, she realized how little of their life she actually understood. She found a thin manila folder labeled Refi 2022. Inside, a loan agreement signed by Max. The principal was far larger than she imagined possible, and it had Elise's digital signature on it. Except she'd never seen this document before. Her breath caught. Not rage, not betrayal, something colder. A kind of clarity. He had forged her signature on a document that tied her to a 6-figure debt secured by their home. But still, she said nothing. Instead, Elise began watching him. In silence, with the careful patience of someone listening for a crack in glass that had not yet shattered. Meanwhile, Max was coming undone. Halberd Financial was bleeding. One of their core clients, a mid-size real estate development firm, had defaulted on a massive debt. Max had authorized a bridge loan to them without full board approval, confident it would be a short-term play. It wasn't. The default triggered a cascade of compliance reviews, investor panic, and a near-immediate withdrawal of half a dozen high-net-worth portfolios. He had known, for months, that the firm was vulnerable. But he had believed in his own myth, that he could fix it. The problem was that the myth had expired. And now, the board was circling. He could feel it in the tone of their emails, in the absence of calls that would have come days earlier. Something was moving behind the scenes. Still, he told no one. Elise, least of all. Instead, Max doubled down. He moved money from their retirement accounts into a personal fund, hoping to recover with a late-stage biotech stock that had been rumored to surge. He used a margin loan to increase leverage. Every move was a bet wrapped in desperation. And each night, he stared at the glowing charts on his laptop like a priest praying over a dying god. But gods, like portfolios, don't respond to worship. Elise, now armed with quiet knowledge, didn't confront him. Instead, she began reconstructing the financial architecture of their lives piece by piece. She called her sister in another state, inquiring about temporary housing for a friend. She reopened a design portfolio she hadn't touched in 6 years. She pulled from storage the large black portfolio case that had once defined her ambition. And then she made a copy of the mortgage documents, along with the forged signature. When Max came home each night, Elise met him with the same softness, the same muted affection. But there was a fracture in her voice that only she could feel, a growing distance that wasn't yet visible but was very much real. Her silence was no longer a symptom of passivity. It was a strategy. Max, oblivious to her discoveries, continued spinning his web of half-truths. He avoided eye contact more often. His laugh grew thinner. When Owen asked if they could go on their annual summer trip to Tahoe, Max said, "We'll see," with a finality that made the boy go quiet. The spreadsheet on Max's hard drive grew uglier. The biotech stock tanked after a clinical trial failure. The margin call hit at 4:12 p.m. on a Thursday. He stared at the red line for 5 full minutes, completely still, while outside his office window, the world moved on without hesitation. Elise had her own moment that week. She was in Owen's room, folding laundry, when she found a drawing he had done in school, a family portrait. 3 people, standing on either side of a tall house. But the lines of the house were cracked, jagged, and underneath it, in scrawled black crayon, he had written, "Home, before it falls." Children always know. The silence between Max and Elise had now hardened into something more dangerous than anger. It had become performance. Each of them living a role they no longer believed in. A man pretending to be in control. A woman pretending not to know he wasn't. And in that quiet theater, something irreversible had already begun. The reckoning arrived not with a scream, but with an envelope, another one. This time it was certified, stamped with urgency, and delivered directly into Elise's hands by a courier who didn't meet her eyes. She signed for it without thinking, then stood in the foyer for a full minute before opening it. Foreclosure notice.it named her, first and last, in block letters, inescapable. It listed the full amount due, the penalties, the timeline. 30 days. After that, the house would be repossessed. Elise read it twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, the same place she had read the first letter weeks earlier, and laid the notice beside it. There was no denying it now. This wasn't a bad quarter or a miscommunication. This was the edge of the cliff. And Max hadn't just driven them here. He had cut the brakes along the way. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the betrayal felt too large for tears. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about trust, about the quiet contract they'd written in years of small gestures and shared decisions. It was about the slow erosion of a partnership she had once believed was built on bedrock. When Max came home that evening, the notice was waiting on the kitchen counter, beneath a heavy glass paperweight. Elise was upstairs. She didn't greet him. She didn't call his name. Max saw the envelope and stopped breathing that he knew what it was without touching it. Knew from the shape, the weight, the angle it sat at, as though the house itself had delivered its final judgment. He reached out, picked it up with trembling fingers, and read the words he'd spent months pretending would never come. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. Elise was standing there already, waiting. Her face was unreadable. Not angry, not even disappointed. Just tired, hollowed out. She didn't speak, and he didn't try. Instead, Max walked past her, into his office, closed the door, and for the first time since he had begun the long spiral of deception, he allowed himself to feel the full gravity of his failure. Inside that room, surrounded by books and plaques and framed degrees, Max collapsed into the leather chair that had once made him feel powerful. Now it felt too large, too cold. He stared at the computer, the blinking cursor on the spreadsheet, the graveyard of numbers that had swallowed his life. Every transaction a wound, every red cell a missed opportunity. To be honest, he thought about his father, a man who had died in silence after a lifetime of financial anxiety. A man who had worked 3 jobs, but never told his family just how fragile everything had been. Max had promised himself he'd never live like that, never make fear his legacy. But here he was, repeating the pattern with different tools, more Polished, more subtle, but just as corrosive. Upstairs, Elise packed a bag, not a dramatic exit. Not a suitcase flung down the stairs. Just a quiet act of preservation. She placed only the essentials inside. Clothes for a few days, her design portfolio, Owen's favorite stuffed animal. Then she sat on the bed and wrote a note. 3 lines. No accusations. Just clarity. She didn't say where she was going. Only that she needed space. And that she was taking Owen with her. When she came downstairs, Max was standing in the foyer, the notice still in his hand. She didn't look at him. She simply walked past, opened the door, and stepped into the night. Owen was already buckled. In the back seat of the car, headphones on, unaware of the finality that hung in the as the car pulled away, Max watched the taillights disappear into the dark curve of the road. And then he was alone. The silence was unbearable. Not just because it was quiet, but because it was honest. It told the truth he had spent years running from. That control was not love, and silence was not protection. In the following days, Max tried to repair what couldn't be repaired. He called Elise's phone, but she didn't answer. He emailed her, only to be met with brief, formal replies. He even visited her sister's house, but Elise refused to come to the door. The board at Halberd Financial called an emergency meeting. He was asked to step down. The margin loans had triggered a compliance review, and the firm needed distance from him. His name, once a mark of trust, had become a liability. The house received its final notice. Max stood in the middle of their glass-walled living room and looked out at the city below, once his kingdom, now a blur of strangers. The walls that had once shimmered in the morning sun now felt transparent in the worst way, exposing every failure, every lie he walked to. The office opened the locked drawer and removed every document. He placed them in a box, along with the framed photo of his family, the one they had taken on the beach in San Diego, before the miscarriages, before the career consumed him, before Elise's smile turned into something guarded. He sat down, opened a blank document on his computer, and began to write. Not a plan, not a pitch, but a letter to Elise, not to win her back, not even to ask for forgiveness, just to finally tell the truth. The letter wasn't long. 3 pages, typed in Max's usual unadorned prose. No flourishes, no appeals to sentiment. Just the truth, stark and complete. He wrote about the fear he had carried like armor, the arrogance that had convinced him. He was the only one who could fix everything, and the shame that had grown louder with each decision he'd hidden from Elise. He told her about the day he refinanced the house without her knowledge. How he had stared at the signature line for minutes before forging her name. Not because he didn't respect her, but because, in that moment, he had reduced love to a ledger. If she didn't know, he thought, she couldn't worry. And if she didn't worry, he hadn't failed her. He had never felt more cowardly in his life. He told her how he'd watched Owen from the hallway one night, the boy asleep with his toy cars still lined up beside him, and realized the future he was gambling wasn't his own, it was theirs. He had betrayed more than a marriage. He had failed as a father, as a man. And the worst part, he wrote, wasn't the fall. It was how long he had pretended they were still flying. He printed the letter, signed it, and mailed it. No email, no PDF, something tangible, something she could hold. Maybe, he thought, the weight of paper would mean more than pixels ever could. Then he moved out of the house. There wasn't much left to take. The furniture would be auctioned when the bank foreclosed. The art had already been appraised and boxed. He packed 2 suitcases and left behind the rest. For the first time in years, Max Stone had nothing curated, nothing staged. Just himself, a used sedan, and the strange emptiness of not knowing what came next. Elise received the letter on a Thursday morning. She read it at the kitchen table, in her sister's house, while Owen worked on a school project in the other room. She read it slowly, carefully, as though parsing something fragile and unstable. When she finished, she folded the pages and pressed them flat beneath her palm. She didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the words confirmed something she already knew deep in her bones. Still, something inside her shifted. For the first time since she left, she saw Max not as the man who had lied, but as the man who was finally telling the truth. It didn't erase the damage, but it allowed for something else, space, not forgiveness. Not yet, but a kind of acknowledgement that what they had built, while cracked and crumbling, had not been entirely hollow. That somewhere beneath the weight of financial ambition and personal silence, there had once been love. She didn't reply to the letter. Instead, Elise took Owen for a walk later that afternoon. They held hands. They talked about nothing urgent, just clouds and ants, and the way leaves curled at the edges in August. It felt ordinary, which, in that moment, was a kind of grace she was beginning to design again. Not full-time, not for clients, just for herself. Small things, textures, patterns. She remembered what it felt like to create without pressure, without audience. It was like rediscovering a limb she thought had gone numb. Max, meanwhile, began working as a freelance consultant, smaller jobs, piecemeal contracts. Humbling work, but honest. He rented a one-bedroom apartment on the east side, with no view and flickering hallway lights. No one cared what he wore. No one asked where he'd worked before. And yet, it felt strangely right that he spent his evenings alone, reading old books he had once pretended to understand, making simple meals, thinking. For the first time in a long while, Max Stone was quiet, not because he was hiding, but because there was nothing left to defend. They didn't speak. Not yet, but every few days, Elise would receive a small deposit into Owen's education account. No note, no explanation, just enough to say, "I remember, I still care," and each time, she would pause, hand hovering over her phone, then set it back. Down. Some things need time. Some silences, once broken, require space before they can become conversation again. Fall arrived with its usual quiet theatrics. Yellow leaves brushing the sidewalks, sharp winds curling around corners, early dusks that made the world feel closer, more contemplative. In another life, Max and Elise might have taken their annual trip to the coast this time of year, staying in the same weathered inn, walking barefoot across cold sand, sharing silence that used to feel companionable. But now, everything was different, and still, the days went on. Owen adjusted faster than either of them expected. Children, after all, are experts at adaptation. He missed the house sometimes, mostly the skylight in his old bedroom and the swing in the back garden, but he never cried over it. Instead, he talked more with his mother, asked bigger questions, became curious about things beyond video games and classroom math. He began drawing again, houses, cities, bridges, blueprints for a world he could build with his own hands. Max remained distant, but present. He hadn't asked for visits, hadn't pleaded or bargained. But every Sunday, like clockwork, he sent Owen a letter. Not an email, a letter, handwritten, always short, a story about his childhood, a riddle, a memory about when Owen was small. He never mentioned Elise, never asked about her. Each letter was simply a rope thrown across the distance, one knot at a time. It took 3 months before Elise wrote back. Her letter was cautious, but not cold. She thanked him for the consistency, for respecting her space. She told him about Owen's new school and the dog they had adopted, an aging rescue with crooked legs and eyes that seemed too human. She mentioned her designs, not in detail, but enough to suggest that something within her was unfolding again. Max didn't reply immediately. He waited a week, then sent a letter that contained just 3 lines. "I'm learning how to live without armor. I'm learning how to lose without vanishing. Thank you for reading this anyway." There were no promises, no questions, just quiet witness to the wreckage they had come through. And that, more than anything, was what Elise noticed. Because survival, when it comes to love and money, doesn't always look like repair. Sometimes it's just two people learning to stand on separate ground, looking honestly at the fault lines between them and not rushing to close them. Eventually, they began to speak again. Brief phone calls, occasional meetings at neutral cafes, where Owen could show Max his drawings and Elise could watch, quietly, as her son's father tried his best to remain steady in a life no longer wrapped in illusion. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic return. The damage done wasn't something time could erase, but it could soften. It could dull the edges. It could make room for something new. Not romance, perhaps, but respect, mutual recognition, the grace of survival, and Max, for all his failures, learned something essential. That truth, when it finally arrives, does not fix what's broken, but it clears the space where something more honest can begin. Their old house was sold to a younger couple. The walls repainted, the garden redone. Elise never drove past it again. Max did, once, by accident. He didn't stop. He didn't linger. He simply looked through the windshield at the life that once was, and then, quietly, kept driving. Because some stories don't end with triumph. Some end with the simple, stubborn act of carrying on, and sometimes that's enough. The end.